Welcome back. In response to Islamic State's dramatic rise, what is Iran's plan? Joining me now from Tehran is Professor Mohamad Marandi. He is the Dean of the Faculty of World Studies at the University of Tehran. Dr. Marandi, thanks for joining us. Let me ask you first, does Iran see ISIL as a threat?
Well, yes, I think the Iranians do see ISIL as a threat, but the threat is really because of the ideology, the extremist ideology that they advocate. And this ideology is not simply in Iraq or in Syria. It exists across the globe, whether it's Boko Haram in Nigeria or in Somalia or in Libya or Afghanistan or Pakistan or even now China. The ideology is one and the same across all these territories. And that ideology is Wahhabism. And it is something that countries like Saudi Arabia have been promoting for decades. So I think that unless Saudi Arabia and other similar countries began to change their policy with regards to this particular ideology, this problem will continue to grow, especially because a lot of oil wealth is being put into the promotion of it.
So, both Iran and the United States have now identified the same threat. Does that create an opportunity for Iran and the United States to act in alliance to take on this threat?
I think the Americans know that the threat of ISIL is its ideology, and that it has grown and has become a very destructive force in more than one country. But at the same time, it seems that the United States really isn't seriously dealing with the problem, because in this coalition that it's built up, it's really a coalition of the guilty. The countries that have been actually supporting these extremists in Syria as well as in Libya and in other places as well, at least ideologically, but in Syria and Libya as a militant force, they've been supported by these countries. So by building a coalition of guilty countries, I don't think the United States is going to do much good. In addition, the real battle is the battle against the ideology, not bombing countries. The United States always seems to think that it can bomb itself out of a problem, whereas ISIL is not a traditional or ordinary army. It doesn't have major military bases, so there aren't many targets on the ground. The more the United States bombs targets, the more civilians are going to be killed, and the more that's going to complicate the situation. So I think that Iran and the United States are very far apart in this. The Iranians also believe that the only way to stop the threat in this region at the moment, besides pushing against the ideology itself, is to support the central government in Damascus as well as in Iraq. The United States wants to battle ISIL in Syria, but also support other extremists that want to fight the government there.
Right, you say Iran and the United States are far apart, but President Hassan Rouhani of Iran has held out the possibility of some kind of cooperation with the United States, but he made it conditional, and one of the conditions, he said, would be that there has to be progress on the nuclear talks.
Without a doubt, President Rouhani is touching upon an issue that for Iranians is very important. The United States can't expect cooperation with Iran in any field as long as it is imposing sanctions that are affecting ordinary people and in fact killing people who, because of difficulties in obtaining certain medicines at times because of the sanctions. So as long as the United States is imposing illegal sanctions that are directed at ordinary men, women, and children, I don't think they should really expect the Iranians to cooperate with them. The Iranians will struggle against extremism of all sorts in the region through its own policies and by supporting legitimate governments such as the government in Syria and Iraq. But I think that it's really going too far for the Americans to expect help when they are trying to hurt Iran. And I must also add that the Iranians believe that their support for Syria and Iraq is what prevented this whole region from collapsing in the face of the ISIL onslaught. So the West has to be really thankful to Iran rather than for its own policies.
You say thankful to Iran, but yet we just had one of our guests saying that the only way the United States should negotiate with Iran is once Iran has seen regime change.
Well, some Americans, their problem is exactly that. They think by bombing other countries, by supporting terrorist organizations, they can create a better world for themselves. What they've ultimately done is that they've destroyed Afghanistan, just in our region alone. They've destroyed Libya, they've helped destroy Yemen and many parts of Syria. They've destabilized the whole region, and they've helped to create terrorism by aligning themselves through an unholy alliance with countries that have been promoting extremism. In Iran, for example, the United States supported the Shah. They supported Saddam Hussein in his aggression against Iran. They gave Saddam Hussein chemical weapons to kill many thousands of innocent Iranians, as well as Iraqis. And they also helped terrorist organizations such as the Mujahideen Khalq, which has killed over 15,000 Iranians and fought alongside Saddam Hussein. The Americans really lose any credibility in this region, and their soft power becomes useless when they behave in such a destructive manner. As long as the Americans continue with this policy, things are going to continue to deteriorate. The reality is that Iran is much stronger today, despite all the American hostility, than it has ever been before. And the United States needs Iran more than ever before, both to confront ISIL and also because the United States is facing many great challenges in this region. Many of the countries that used to be American allies or are American allies have either collapsed or are beginning to wobble. So it's best for the Americans to behave more reasonably and to produce new policies, to think of a solution and rapprochement with Iran, because Iran isn't going anywhere.
Talking about new policies, you mentioned earlier on that in this war against ISIL, it's not a war against people and guns. Well, it's that as well, but it's mainly a war against an ideology. So given that, can an ideology like that be defeated? Do you see victory in this?
Personally, I think yes, it's very much possible, because ISIL really didn't exist as a major ideology decades ago. Sunni Islam is very different from Wahhabi Islam. The rise of the ideology behind ISIL was basically due to oil wealth, and it increased over the last few decades. And Western countries allowed this to happen, and they also supported it in many ways, such as in Afghanistan, because they thought it could be useful against the Soviet Union or against Iran. And it blew up in their face during 9/11, on 9/11. And again in Syria, the Western countries from the very beginning, they allowed extremists to pour into Syria. For example, one major figure was Abdul Hakim Belhaj, a major Libyan Taliban and Al-Qaeda affiliate, and he was supported by certain countries, and NATO began to cooperate with him and others like him. They overthrew the government in Libya, and then he went to Turkey and negotiated with the Free Syrian Army, gave them weapons, gave them volunteers and money. So Al-Qaeda was cooperating with certain countries in Libya, as well as NATO countries in Syria, and that's just one example.
Okay, so we're going to have to leave it there. Dr. Mohamad Marandi, thanks for joining us. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. We'd love to hear from you, so please send us your questions, comments, and story ideas to theheat@cctv-america.com, and we'd like to continue the conversation on social media. Give us your thoughts and comments on our Facebook page, that's CCTV America. I'm Anand in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.